At my nephew's graduation party, my successful brother Daniel loudly announced to everyone, "At least someone in this family made something of themselves," unlike my sister, who's still just a courthouse janitor at 42. The entire backyard went silent. Then his CEO, Mr. Thornfield, walked over, extended his hand to me, and said with deep respect, "Your Honor, what an unexpected pleasure to see you here." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Rebecca Clearwater, and for the past 3 years, I've been letting my family believe I work as a janitor at the Riverside County Courthouse. Every morning at 6 a.m., I put on my simple work clothes, grab my thermos of coffee, and drive my modest Honda Civic to the imposing brick building downtown. What my family doesn't know is that I park in the reserved spot marked Judge R. Clearwater and enter through the judge's private entrance. You see, 3 years ago, I was appointed as the youngest family court judge in Riverside County's history at age 39. It was the culmination of 15 years of grueling work: law school while waitressing nights, clerking for federal judges, prosecuting cases as an assistant district attorney, and finally, private practice specializing in family law. When Governor Hayes called to offer me the position, I cried for an hour. But there was one problem: my family. My older brother Daniel had always been the golden child. At 45, he's the regional sales director for Pinnacle Industries, one of the largest manufacturing companies in the Pacific Northwest. He drives a BMW, lives in a sprawling house in the exclusive Maplewood Hills neighborhood, and never lets anyone forget his success. Growing up, our parents constantly compared us. "Why can't you be more like Daniel?" became the soundtrack of my childhood. When I graduated law school, Daniel rolled his eyes. "More school? When are you going to get a real job?" When I became a prosecutor, he said, "Government work doesn't pay anything. You'll never afford the nice things in life." When I opened my private practice, he smirked. "Solo practice? That's just a fancy way of being unemployed." So when I got the judgeship, something inside me snapped. I was tired of his condescension, tired of proving myself, tired of his constant need to diminish my achievements. Instead of announcing my appointment, I simply told my family I'd taken a job at the courthouse. I let them assume whatever they wanted. The assumptions were immediate and predictable. "Courthouse work, huh?" Daniel had said with that familiar smirk. "Well, I guess steady employment is better than nothing. Probably decent benefits at least." My mother, Patricia, had patted my hand sympathetically. "Oh, honey, that's wonderful. Court clerks do important work." I didn't correct them when they assumed I was janitorial staff. I just let them believe it. For 3 years, I've sat through family dinners, listening to Daniel's success stories. His latest promotion, his company car upgrade, his business trips to Seattle and Portland, his networking events with important people. He'd always make sure to include some comment about my situation. "At least Rebecca has job security," he'd say with false sympathy. "The courts always need cleaning staff." Or, "It's honest work, Becca. Not everyone can be in management." My sister-in-law Carmen would give me pitying looks and occasionally slip me gift cards for groceries or offer to help me apply for better positions. My teenage nephew, Tyler, seemed embarrassed that his aunt was just a janitor while his father was this big corporate success story. The irony was crushing. As a family court judge, I make $165,000 a year. I own a beautiful townhouse in downtown Willowbrook, drive a reliable car by choice, not necessity, and have an investment portfolio that would make Daniel's jaw drop. I regularly make decisions that affect hundreds of families, have my rulings cited in legal journals, and receive respect from attorneys who've practiced law longer than I've been alive. But every family gathering, I put on my carefully crafted costume of the struggling younger sister, grateful for Daniel's occasional $20 loans and advice about improving my situation. Why did I keep up this charade for 3 years? Pride, maybe. Or perhaps I wanted to see how long Daniel would continue his superiority complex without any real knowledge of my life. Maybe I was conducting my own little social experiment about assumptions and family dynamics. The breaking point came at Tyler's high school graduation party last Saturday. Daniel had invited his entire company's regional management team to our family barbecue, ostensibly to celebrate Tyler, but really to show off his successful family life to his colleagues and superiors. I arrived in my usual simple clothes: khaki pants, a plain blue blouse, and comfortable walking shoes. I brought a modest graduation gift and congratulated Tyler on his acceptance to Portland State University. I was content to blend into the background, make small talk with family friends, and escape early as I usually did. But Daniel was in rare form that day, clearly trying to impress his work colleagues with his wit and family dynamics. The backyard was full of his coworkers, including several executives I didn't recognize, all drinking beer and eating from the elaborate spread Carmen had prepared. That's when it happened. Daniel, standing near the deck with a beer in his hand and his voice slightly elevated from alcohol, decided to make me the punchline of his success story. "You know what I love about family?" he announced to the group around him, gesturing grandly. "We all find our place in the world. Some of us climb the corporate ladder. Some of us find our calling in simpler work." The conversation around the yard was starting to quiet as people sensed a speech coming. "At least someone in this family made something of themselves," Daniel continued, nodding toward Tyler, "unlike my sister, who's still just a courthouse janitor at 42. The silence that followed was deafening. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. To understand how devastating Daniel's public humiliation was meant to be, you need to know the full story of our family dynamics and how I ended up living this double life for 3 years. Growing up in Willowbrook, Daniel and I were as different as two siblings could be. He was the natural salesman, charismatic, confident, always working the room at family gatherings and school events. I was the quiet one with my nose in books, spending afternoons at the Willowbrook Public Library while Daniel was captain of the varsity soccer team and student body treasurer. Our parents, Robert and Patricia Clearwater, owned a small accounting firm that served local businesses. They weren't wealthy, but they were comfortable, and they had very clear ideas about success. Success meant making good money, driving a nice car, living in the right neighborhood, and most importantly, being respected in the community for your accomplishments. Daniel embodied everything they valued. By age 25, he was already making 6 figures in medical device sales. By 30, he'd bought his house in Maplewood Hills, the neighborhood where all the doctors, lawyers, and business executives lived. He married Carmen, a beautiful former marketing coordinator who quit her job to focus on supporting Daniel's career and raising their family. Meanwhile, I was still in law school at 31, working nights at Rossetti's Italian restaurant to pay my bills, driving a beat-up Toyota Corolla, and living in a studio apartment above Henderson's hardware store on Main Street. Every family dinner became a subtle interrogation about my progress and timeline. "Rebecca's taking the long road to success," Dad would say diplomatically, while Mom would add, "Law school is so expensive, honey. Are you sure this is practical?" Daniel would just smile that knowing smile and change the subject to his latest sales achievement or company recognition. The worst part wasn't their disappointment. It was their pity. They saw my dedication to law school not as ambition, but as stubbornness. They saw my financial struggles not as temporary sacrifices, but as evidence that I'd chosen the wrong path. When I graduated law school at 34, their congratulations felt hollow, overshadowed by Daniel's announcement that same month about his promotion to regional director. My early legal career only reinforced their concerns. As an assistant district attorney, I made $48,000 a year, less than Daniel spent on his annual vacation. I prosecuted domestic violence cases, child custody disputes, and juvenile offenses. The work was meaningful, but emotionally draining. and it certainly wasn't glamorous. "She's helping people," Mom would say defensively when her friends asked about me, "but she's not really making much money." Dad would nod and add, "The government doesn't pay well, but at least it's steady work." Daniel was more direct. "Becca, you're brilliant, but you're wasting your potential in the public sector. You should come work in corporate law, make some real money. I could introduce you to some people." His condescension was wrapped in concern, which somehow made it worse. When I left the DA's office to start my own family law practice, the family's anxiety reached new heights. "Solo practice is so risky," Carmen worried. "What if you can't find enough clients?" Daniel was blunter. "Most solo practices fail within 2 years. Maybe you should have stayed with the steady government paycheck." For 4 years, I built my practice case by case. I specialized in complex custody disputes and domestic relations, often representing women who couldn't afford the big law firms but needed aggressive advocacy. My reputation grew slowly but steadily within the legal community. Other attorneys began referring their toughest cases to me. I won several high-profile appeals that established important precedents for children's rights. But to my family, I was still struggling, Rebecca, working too hard for too little money, making poor life choices. The irony was that during those years, I was becoming exactly what our parents claimed to value: successful, respected in my field, making a real difference in the community. But because my success didn't look like Daniel's success, they couldn't see it. When Judge Morrison announced his retirement from the family court bench, several attorneys encouraged me to apply. The appointment process was rigorous. Extensive background checks, interviews with the Judicial Nominating Commission, public hearings, and finally, selection by the governor. When I was chosen from a field of 43 candidates, it was validation of everything I'd worked toward. But I knew how my family would react. They'd find ways to diminish it. Government job. Not much money for all that education. So much stress. They'd compare it unfavorably to Daniel's corporate achievements. They'd make it about them somehow. Mom would worry about my safety dealing with difficult cases. Dad would question the retirement benefits. And Daniel would have opinions about my career choices. So I made a decision that seemed brilliant at the time. I simply didn't tell them the whole truth. When I said I'd gotten a job at the courthouse, I let them draw their own conclusions. When they assumed I was a clerk, I didn't correct them. When they eventually decided I must be janitorial staff, I went along with it. It started as a simple omission and evolved into an elaborate deception. The practical aspects were easier to manage than I'd expected. I never brought work home. Judicial ethics prohibited it anyway. I dressed down for family events, drove my modest car, and lived in my comfortable but unpretentious townhouse. When they occasionally asked about work, I kept my answers vague. Long days, lots of different cases. The people I work with are nice. Daniel's condescension actually made the lie easier to maintain. He never asked detailed questions about my job because he assumed there was nothing interesting to know. Carmen never visited my workplace because why would she? My parents never bragged about my courthouse work to their friends because they were slightly embarrassed by it. For 3 years, I lived this strange double life. At work, I was the Honorable Rebecca Clearwater, respected by attorneys, trusted by families, making decisions that shaped lives. At family gatherings, I was poor Rebecca, the disappointment, grateful for Daniel's occasional financial advice and career guidance. Until Tyler's graduation party, when my two worlds were about to collide in the most spectacular way possible. The moment Daniel's words hit the air, I felt every eye in the backyard turn toward me. The casual conversation stopped mid-sentence. Someone turned down the music. Even the kids playing cornhole in the corner seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere and paused their game. I stood there holding my plastic cup of lemonade, feeling the familiar flush of embarrassment creep up my neck. This wasn't the first time Daniel had made me the subject of his public commentary, but something about doing it in front of his entire work team felt particularly cruel. I could see Carmen's face from across the yard. She looked mortified, probably realizing her husband had just crossed a line even by his own standards. Tyler, my 17-year-old nephew, was standing near the graduation banner with his friends from school. His face had gone bright red, and I could see him looking between his father and me with an expression that mixed embarrassment with something that might have been anger. He'd grown up watching his dad treat me this way, but he'd never seen it displayed so publicly before. "Daniel," Carmen called from near the food table, her voice tight with warning. But Daniel was on a roll now, clearly enjoying the attention from his colleagues. He'd had just enough beer to loosen his tongue, but not enough to slur his words, which made him particularly dangerous. "Don't get me wrong," he continued, gesturing toward me with his beer bottle. "Honest work is honest work. Someone has to clean the bathrooms and empty the trash cans, right? At least she's contributing to society in her own small way." A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the crowd, the kind of nervous laughter that happens when people don't know how to react to someone else's cruelty. I recognized some faces from Daniel's company, younger salespeople who probably felt obligated to laugh at their director's jokes, a few middle management types who looked distinctly uncomfortable, and several people I didn't recognize at all. My mother appeared at my elbow, probably sensing the need for damage control. "Rebecca works very hard," she said loudly enough for others to hear, her voice carrying that defensive tone she'd perfected over the years. "The courthouse is lucky to have such a dedicated employee." Even my mother's attempt at support stung. She meant well, but her words only reinforced the narrative Daniel had created. I wasn't a respected professional. I was a dedicated employee who worked very hard. The kind of praise you give to someone whose efforts matter more than their achievements. "Of course she works hard," Daniel said, his voice carrying that false magnanimity that made my skin crawl. "That's what I respect about Becca. She shows up every day, puts in her 8 hours, never complains. Not everyone needs to be ambitious, you know. Some people are perfectly happy with simple, steady work." The word simple hung in the air like a slap. I'd prosecuted cases that made headlines, written legal briefs that changed state precedent, made custody decisions that protected children from dangerous situations, and sentenced domestic abusers to prison. In the past month alone, I'd presided over cases involving multi-million-dollar property disputes, complex international custody arrangements, and adoption proceedings that created families. Simple work. I looked around the crowd and tried to identify Daniel's colleagues. There was a group of younger people who were clearly his direct reports. They were laughing a little too enthusiastically at his comments, obviously trying to score points with their boss. Near the deck, I spotted what looked like senior management. Older, more expensively dressed, watching the spectacle with various degrees of amusement and discomfort. One man in particular caught my attention. He was probably in his late 50s, wearing a crisp white polo shirt and expensive-looking khakis. He had salt and pepper hair, sharp blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of bearing that suggested he was used to being the most important person in any room. He wasn't laughing at Daniel's performance. Instead, he was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Curiosity, maybe, or concern. "Daniel, maybe we should—" Carmen tried again, but Daniel cut her off with a wave of his hand. "Let me finish," he said. "I'm making a point here about family and success and how we all find our place in the world." He turned back to his audience, clearly warming to his theme. "See, the thing about Rebecca is that she's never really understood ambition. Even in high school, she was content to just get good grades and stay in the background. I was out there playing sports, running for student government, networking with people who mattered. I felt something cold and sharp settle in my stomach. This wasn't just casual condescension anymore. This was character assassination. Daniel was systematically dismantling my entire identity in front of a crowd of strangers, reducing my life to a series of failures and missed opportunities. College was the same story, he continued. I went straight into sales after graduation, started making real money immediately. Rebecca? She spent years and years in school, racking up debt, studying subjects that don't really matter in the real world. And where did all that education get her? Pushing a mop around a courthouse. The man in the white polo shirt stepped slightly closer, and I noticed his expression had shifted from curiosity to something that looked almost like recognition. He was studying my face intently, as if trying to place me. A small frown creased his forehead. "Now don't misunderstand me," Daniel said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone that made my hands clench into fists. "I'm not criticizing Rebecca's choices. She's found her level, and there's nothing wrong with that. Not everyone can handle the pressure of real responsibility, the stress of making important decisions, the demands of leadership." The irony was so thick I almost choked on it. In the past week alone, I'd made decisions about child custody that would affect families for decades. Ruled on domestic violence cases that literally determined whether women and children would be safe, and presided over adoption hearings that created permanent families. The stress of real responsibility? I'd sent men to prison for domestic violence just 3 days earlier. Some people, Daniel continued, are just more comfortable taking orders than giving them, following procedures rather than creating them. And you know what? Society needs those people too. We can't all be leaders. The man in the white polo shirt was definitely staring at me now, and I saw him pull out his phone. He seemed to be scrolling through something, occasionally glancing up at me and then back at his screen. Whatever he was looking at was clearly confirming some suspicion he'd developed. I realized I was at a crossroads. I could continue standing there, absorbing Daniel's public humiliation, playing the role of the grateful, struggling younger sister who appreciated his wisdom and success. I could smile weakly, make some self-deprecating comment, and let him have his moment of superiority in front of his colleagues. Or I could wait and see what happened next. Because something was definitely about to happen. The man with the phone was walking toward us now, his expression shifting from curiosity to what looked like excitement mixed with disbelief. He moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to command, and I noticed that other people instinctively stepped aside to let him pass. Daniel, oblivious to the approaching interruption, was building toward what sounded like his grand finale. "The point is," he said, spreading his arms wide in a gesture of magnanimous conclusion, "we should all be grateful for the Rebecca Clearwaters of the world, the people who do the jobs nobody else wants to do, who keep society running behind the scenes, who—" "Excuse me," said a deep, authoritative voice from directly behind him. Daniel turned around, and I watched his face change as he realized who had interrupted him. The confident smirk faltered, replaced by the slightly panicked expression of an employee who's been caught off guard by senior management. The man in the white polo shirt extended his hand toward me, and when he spoke, his voice carried the unmistakable tone of genuine respect and recognition. "Your Honor," he said clearly, his words cutting through the backyard chatter like a bell, "what an unexpected pleasure to see you here." The words "Your Honor" seemed to echo across the backyard like a thunderclap. Every conversation stopped. The cornhole game froze mid-throw. Even the neighbor's dog stopped barking. For a moment that felt like an eternity, the only sound was the distant hum of traffic from Maple Avenue and the gentle bubbling of Carmen's decorative fountain. Daniel's face went through a series of expressions so rapidly it was almost comical. Confusion, disbelief, irritation, and then a forced smile as he tried to process what he'd just heard. He looked at the man addressing me, then back at me, then at the man again, as if he could somehow rearrange reality by changing his focus. "I'm sorry," Daniel said with a nervous laugh, "but I think there's been some mistake. This is my sister Rebecca. She works at the courthouse, but she's not." "Judge Rebecca Clearwater," the man continued, extending his hand to me with obvious respect. "I'm James Thornfield, CEO of Pinnacle Industries. I had the privilege of appearing before your court last year during the Morrison custody case. You probably don't remember me specifically, but your handling of that complex situation was truly impressive." I shook his hand, feeling surreal about this moment I'd never planned for. "Mr. Thornfield, of course I remember. Your testimony about the company's family leave policies was instrumental in reaching the right decision for that family. How is young Emma doing? Thriving, he said with a warm smile. Thanks to your wise ruling, her mother tells me she's doing beautifully in her new school. The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel dozens of eyes boring into me, trying to reconcile what they'd just heard with everything Daniel had told them about his, quote, janitor sister. Carmen had gone completely white and was gripping the edge of the food table so hard, her knuckles looked bloodless. Tyler's mouth was hanging open, his graduation cap tilted at an odd angle as he stared at me in shock. But it was Daniel's face that I'll never forget. The confident smirk had completely disappeared, replaced by something between panic and nausea. His beer bottle was tilting dangerously in his loose grip, foam threatening to spill onto his expensive polo shirt. "Judge?" he whispered, the word coming out like a question he was afraid to ask. Mr. Thornfield seemed to realize he'd stepped into some kind of family situation, but to his credit, he didn't retreat. Instead, he turned to address the broader group with the kind of smooth social skills you'd expect from a CEO. "I hope you'll forgive the interruption," he said to the crowd, but when I recognized Judge Clearwater, I couldn't pass up the opportunity to thank her personally. She presided over one of the most complex custody cases our company has ever been involved in, our employee Sarah Morrison's divorce. The situation involved international custody disputes, complex financial arrangements, and some very delicate family dynamics. He turned back to me, his voice carrying genuine admiration. "Your Honor, the way you balanced the competing interests while keeping the child's welfare paramount was masterful. The legal community has been talking about your ruling for months. I believe the State Bar Journal featured it as a case study in judicial excellence." "That's very kind of you to say," I managed, still feeling like I was watching this scene happen to someone else. The Morrison case was indeed complex, but that's what makes family law so challenging and rewarding. "Complex?" Daniel interjected, his voice strained. "Rebecca, what is he talking about? You can't be a judge?" Mr. Thornfield finished, looking genuinely puzzled. "Oh, but she absolutely is. Judge Clearwater has one of the finest legal minds in the state. Her decisions on family law have been cited in appellate courts throughout the Pacific Northwest." The crowd was starting to murmur now, quiet conversations breaking out as people tried to understand what they were witnessing. I could hear fragments. Did he say judge? His sister is a judge? But didn't he just say she was a janitor? Carmen had found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Rebecca, is this true? Are you really a judge?" Before I could answer, Tyler stepped forward, his teenage voice cracking with emotion. "Dad, you said Aunt Rebecca cleaned bathrooms. You've been saying that for years. You made me embarrassed to tell my friends what she did for work." The hurt in his voice cut through me like a knife. This brilliant, kind young man had spent his entire adolescence thinking his aunt was someone to be pitied rather than admired. How many times had he listened to his father's condescending comments about my simple work and lack of ambition? "I don't understand," Daniel said, and for the first time in my adult life I heard genuine vulnerability in his voice. "Rebecca, you told us you worked at the courthouse. You said you had a job there. You never said you were a judge," I finished quietly. "I never said I wasn't one either." Mr. Thornfield was clearly beginning to understand the family dynamics he'd stumbled into, and his expression shifted from puzzlement to something approaching concern. "I hope I haven't caused any family tension," he said diplomatically. "I simply wanted to express my appreciation for Judge Clearwater's excellent work." "Excellent work," repeated one of Daniel's younger colleagues, a woman named Jessica whom I'd met briefly earlier. "So when you said she emptied trash cans—" "I never said that," Daniel snapped, but his voice lacked conviction. Several people in the crowd were nodding, clearly remembering his exact words from just minutes earlier. My mother had materialized beside me, her face cycling through confusion, pride, and what looked like embarrassment. "Rebecca, sweetheart," she said carefully, "are you telling us you've been a judge this whole time? For how long?" 3 years, I said simply. 3 years? My father's voice boomed from across the yard. He was pushing through the crowd, his face flushed with what I couldn't tell was anger or excitement. You've been a judge for 3 years and you didn't tell us? The accusation in his voice stung, but before I could respond, Mr. Thornfield interjected again. If I may, he said, his CEO instincts clearly kicking in to manage what was becoming an uncomfortable situation. Judge Clearwater was appointed to the bench quite young. She's one of the youngest family court judges in state history, if I'm not mistaken. It's a tremendous honor and reflects exceptional legal ability. Appointed by whom? Daniel asked, though he seemed afraid of the answer. Governor Hayes, I said quietly, after a comprehensive vetting process by the Judicial Nominating Commission. The weight of that statement settled over the crowd. Governor Hayes was widely respected across party lines, and everyone knew that judicial appointments went through rigorous scrutiny. This wasn't some minor position or political favor. This was recognition of genuine professional excellence. The governor, Tyler repeated, awe creeping into his voice. Aunt Rebecca, you know the governor. We've met, I said with what I hoped was a modest smile, though I wouldn't say we're friends. Carmen had finally found her voice, though it came out shaky. Rebecca, the salary. Judges make good money, don't they? We've been giving you grocery store gift cards for years, thinking you were struggling financially. The grocery store gift cards. The $20 loans from Daniel. The pitying looks when I drove my modest car or wore simple clothes to family gatherings. Every gesture of charity and condescension suddenly took on a different meaning. Federal judges make around $180,000, Mr. Thornfield said helpfully, then caught himself. Though I shouldn't discuss a lady's salary. Forgive me, Your Honor. State judges make slightly less, I said, deciding to throw him a lifeline, but it's comfortable compensation. $165,000 a year, more than Daniel made, though I wasn't about to announce that fact. But I could see him doing the math in his head, his face growing paler as the implications sank in. So, when I offered to help you find a better job, Daniel started, then trailed off. You were offering to help a sitting judge find employment, I confirmed gently. The mortification on his face was almost painful to watch. This was my brother, despite everything, and seeing him realize the full scope of his mistake was more devastating than I'd anticipated. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Thornfield announced to the crowd, clearly trying to restore some dignity to the situation, it's been my pleasure to meet Judge Clearwater's family. I should return to celebrating this fine young man's graduation. He shook Tyler's hand and congratulated him on his acceptance to Portland State, then turned back to me. Your Honor, I hope we'll have the opportunity to speak again under less surprising circumstances. Please give my regards to Chief Judge Harrison. As he walked away, the crowd began to disperse, but the conversations were animated. I could hear the whispered discussions, the rapid exchange of information, as people tried to process what they'd just witnessed. And in the center of it all stood Daniel, looking like his entire world had just been turned upside down. Which, I supposed, it had. After Mr. Thornfield's departure, the backyard felt like the aftermath of a social earthquake. Most of Daniel's colleagues had tactfully retreated to the far corners of the yard, engaging in animated conversations while stealing glances back at our family cluster. The graduation celebration that was supposed to showcase Daniel's success had transformed into something entirely different. Tyler was the first to break the stunned silence. Aunt Rebecca, he said, his voice a mixture of awe and hurt, why didn't you tell us? All these years, I thought. Dad always said you were struggling, I finished gently. I know what your father said. Daniel's face had progressed from pale to a sickly green color. He set his beer bottle down on the nearest table with shaking hands and turned to face me fully. Rebecca, I need to understand this. You've been letting us believe you worked janitorial services for 3 years. 3 years. Do you have any idea how this makes me look? The selfishness of his first concern wasn't lost on anyone. Carmen shot him a sharp look, and I saw my mother's eyebrows rise in that way they did when she was about to deliver a lecture about priorities. "How it makes you look?" Tyler asked, his teenage indignation flaring. "Dad, you just spent 10 minutes telling your entire company that Aunt Rebecca empties trash cans and has no ambition. In front of everyone, including your boss." "Tyler's right," Carmen said quietly, finding her voice. "Daniel, you humiliated yourself, and you humiliated Rebecca. And you did it publicly, in front of people who actually know who she is professionally." My father had been uncharacteristically quiet during this exchange, but now he stepped forward with the methodical approach that had made him a successful accountant. "Rebecca, help me understand the timeline here. You were appointed as a judge 3 years ago. That would have been right around the time you told us about the courthouse job." "June 15th, 2021, I said. "I was sworn in on a Tuesday morning. Judge Morrison's retirement ceremony was that Friday." "And you came to Sunday dinner that weekend?" Mom recalled, her memory sharpening as she focused on the details. "You said you'd started working at the courthouse, and we were so relieved that you'd found steady employment after closing your practice." "I never closed my practice," I said quietly. "I transitioned my clients to other attorneys when I accepted the appointment. That's standard procedure for judicial ethics." Daniel was staring at me like I was speaking a foreign language. "You transitioned your clients?" "Rebecca, your practice was barely surviving. You were always worried about making rent, always talking about difficult cases that didn't pay well." "I represented a lot of pro bono clients," I explained. "Domestic violence victims, families in custody disputes who couldn't afford legal fees. Just because the work didn't pay well doesn't mean my practice was failing." "But you drove that old Honda," Carmen protested. "You lived in that tiny apartment above the hardware store. You always seemed so financially stressed." I looked around at my family's confused faces and realized how carefully I'd cultivated the image they'd formed of me. "I drive a 2019 Honda Civic because it's reliable and fuel efficient. I lived above Henderson's Hardware because it was convenient to downtown and I liked the location. And yes, I was financially stressed during law school and my early career, but by the time I opened my practice, I was doing fine." "How fine?" Daniel asked, and I could hear the anxiety creeping into his voice. Before I could answer, Tyler pulled out his phone. "I'm looking this up," he announced. "Judge salaries are public record, right?" "Tyler, maybe that's not." Carmen started, but he was already scrolling. "Holy crap," he whispered, then caught himself. "Sorry, Mom." "But Aunt Rebecca, it says here that family court judges in our state make between $155,000 and $175,000 annually." The number hung in the air like a challenge. Daniel made a small choking sound. I knew he made around $140,000 as regional sales director. Excellent money, but not quite what his younger sister had been earning while he was offering her career advice. "That's more than Dad makes," Tyler continued, seemingly oblivious to the impact of his words. "Aunt Rebecca, you make more money than Dad?" "Tyler," I said gently, "that's not really the point." "But it is the point," my father interrupted, his accountant's mind clearly working through the implications. "Rebecca, if you've been making that kind of salary for 3 years, why have you been accepting our help? The grocery gift cards, the cash Daniel's given you, the times we've paid for your meals at restaurants." The question hit like a physical blow. I'd forgotten about all the small ways my family had tried to help their struggling sister over the years. Carmen's grocery gift cards during tight months. Daniel's $20 and $50 loans that he'd never expected to be repaid. My parents insisting on paying for family dinners because they worried I couldn't afford them. I started, then stopped. How could I explain that I'd been so caught up in maintaining the deception that I'd accepted their charity rather than blow my cover? "You've been taking money from us," Daniel said slowly, as if the full realization was just hitting him. "Money you didn't need. Money you make more than any of us." I tried to refuse sometimes. I said weakly, knowing how inadequate it sounded. Tried to refuse? Mom echoed. Rebecca, last Christmas I gave you $500 because I was worried about your heating bills. You were making over $160,000 a year and you let me worry about you freezing in your apartment? The hurt in her voice was devastating. I'd been so focused on the satisfaction of surprising Daniel that I'd forgotten about the genuine love and concern my family had shown for what they believed was my difficult situation. Carmen was shaking her head in disbelief. The girls' trip to Portland last spring. We didn't invite you because we thought you couldn't afford it. We felt terrible about it, but we didn't want to put you in the awkward position of having to decline. And my graduation present, Tyler added, his voice getting quieter. I felt bad asking for the laptop because I knew money was tight for you. I almost asked for something cheaper. Each revelation was like another weight added to my chest. I'd been so caught up in punishing Daniel for his condescension that I'd hurt people who genuinely cared about me. People who'd made real sacrifices because they thought I needed help. This is insane, Daniel muttered, running his hands through his hair. Rebecca, why would you do this? Why would you lie to your own family for 3 years? Before I could answer, one of his colleagues approached hesitantly. It was Jessica, the younger woman who'd laughed at his jokes earlier. She looked deeply uncomfortable but determined. Daniel, she said quietly, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think you should know. Some of us recognized Judge Clearwater from the news coverage of the Brennan case last year. The domestic violence case that changed state policy? She was the judge who sentenced that man to the maximum penalty after he violated his restraining order. Daniel turned to stare at me with fresh shock. The Brennan case made national news. You were on CNN. Briefly, I said. It wasn't about me personally, it was about the legal precedent. You were on CNN, Tyler repeated, awe creeping back into his voice. My aunt was on CNN and I didn't even know. Jessica shifted uncomfortably. Daniel, I think you should also know that some of the things you said earlier, about Rebecca's work ethic and ambition, well, they don't really match up with someone who gets appointed to the bench at 39. That's considered quite an achievement in the legal profession. The implications of what she was saying weren't lost on anyone. Daniel hadn't just made ignorant comments about a janitor. He'd publicly dismissed the accomplishments of one of the youngest judges in state history. In front of his colleagues, including his CEO. Oh God, Carmen whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. Daniel, Mr. Thornfield heard everything you said. Your boss heard you call a respected judge lazy and unambitious. Daniel's face went from green to gray. Rebecca, I need to know everything, right now. No more games, no more deception. I need to understand exactly what you do, how long you've been doing it, and why you've been lying to us. The investigation was about to begin in earnest, and I realized there was no going back. The 3-year charade was over, and now I had to face not just Daniel's humiliation, but the deeper questions about why I'd chosen deception over truth, and who had been hurt by my decision to live this elaborate lie. All right, I said, taking a deep breath, but maybe we should do this inside. This conversation is going to take a while. Inside Daniel and Carmen's living room, the atmosphere felt heavy with expectation and dread. Carmen had quickly ushered the remaining party guests toward the backyard patio, making polite excuses about family business that needed attention. Through the large windows, I could see Daniel's colleagues milling around awkwardly, probably discussing what they'd just witnessed with the kind of fascinated horror usually reserved for car accidents. My parents sat rigidly on the leather sectional, their faces wearing identical expressions of bewildered hurt. Tyler had claimed the armchair nearest to me, still clutching his phone and occasionally glancing at it as if he might find more revelations about his aunt's secret life. Daniel paced behind the couch like a caged animal, while Carmen perched on the edge of the coffee table, her party hostess smile long abandoned. Start from the beginning, Daniel said without preamble. I want to know everything. When you got this appointment, how much you make, where you actually live, what you drive when you're not pretending to be poor, everything. The harshness in his voice stung, but I knew I'd earned it. "All right," I said, folding my hands in my lap. "But first, I need you all to understand something. I never intended for this to go on so long. It started as an omission, and it just grew from there." "An omission that lasted 3 years," my father said dryly. "That's not an omission, Rebecca. That's a sustained deception." He was right, and we all knew it. I took a deep breath and began. "When Governor Hayes offered me the appointment, I was shocked. There were 43 candidates, including attorneys with decades more experience than me. The selection process took 8 months. Background checks, interviews, public hearings. When I got the call, it felt like validation of everything I'd worked toward." "Why didn't you tell us immediately?" Mom asked, her voice small and hurt. I looked at her loving, confused face and felt my heart break a little. "Because I knew how you'd react. I knew Daniel would find some way to diminish it, and I knew you and Dad would worry about the stress and the danger of dealing with difficult cases. I was tired of having my achievements measured against Daniel's corporate success." "So you decided to let us think you were a janitor instead?" Tyler asked, his teenage directness cutting through any attempt at diplomatic explanation. "I didn't decide anything initially," I said. "When I told you I'd gotten a job at the courthouse, you all assumed it was clerical work. When you guessed I might be in maintenance, I just didn't correct you." Daniel stopped pacing and whirled around to face me. "Rebecca, do you understand what you've done to me? I just spent the last 3 years giving you career advice. I offered to help you network, to introduce you to people who could give you better opportunities. I've been patronizing a sitting judge for 3 years. You've been patronizing me for 30 years, I shot back, my own anger finally surfacing. "This isn't about the last 3 years, Daniel. This is about a lifetime of you treating me like I'm not smart enough, not ambitious enough, not successful enough to meet your standards." Carmen leaned forward. "Rebecca, that's not fair. Daniel loves you. We all do. We were worried about you. We were trying to help." "Were you?" I asked. "Or were you just comfortable with the idea that I was the family failure, the one who made Daniel look even better by comparison?" The words hung in the air like an accusation. My mother gasped softly, and I saw Tyler's eyes widen as he processed what I'd said. "That's a terrible thing to say," Dad said quietly. "We've never thought of you as a failure." "Haven't you?" I stood up, the 3 years of suppressed resentment finally finding their voice. "Dad, when I graduated law school summa cum laude, your first question was whether I'd be able to pay back my loans. When I passed the bar exam on my first try, you worried about whether I'd be able to find steady work. When I opened my own practice, you suggested I might be happier as a paralegal for an established firm. We were being practical," Mom protested. "We wanted you to be secure." "You wanted me to be safe," I corrected. "You wanted me to aim low enough that I couldn't fail spectacularly. But Daniel? When Daniel got his first sales job, you threw him a party. When he bought his house, you bragged about it to everyone you knew. When he got promoted, you framed his company newsletter announcement." Daniel's face had gone from angry to stricken. "Rebecca, I had no idea you felt that way." "Of course you didn't," I said, my voice getting louder despite my efforts to stay calm. "Because you were too busy being the golden child to notice that your success always came with a footnote about my lack thereof." Tyler cleared his throat. Aunt Rebecca, can we maybe get back to the specifics because I'm trying to understand how this actually worked. Where do you really live?" I sat back down, forcing myself to calm down. "I own a townhouse in Riverside Commons, 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, with a view of the river. I bought it 2 years ago." "Riverside Commons?" Carmen's voice pitched higher. "Those start at $400,000. "Mine was $485,000, I said quietly. Daniel made a strangled sound. "You own a $500,000 house and you've been letting Mom give you grocery money?" The shame of that hit me fully for the first time. "I know how it sounds." "It sounds like theft," my father said bluntly. "Rebecca, we've given you thousands of dollars over the years because we thought you were struggling." "How many thousands?" Daniel asked, his business mind clearly calculating. Mom looked stricken. The grocery cards alone. I gave you $50 a month for 2 years. That's $1,200, plus the cash for emergencies, the times we've paid for dinners, the Christmas money. The car repairs, Dad added grimly. We paid for your transmission work last year, $800. And I gave you money whenever you asked, Daniel said, his voice getting dangerously quiet. 50 here, 100 there. Just until payday, you'd say. How much, Rebecca? How much money did you take from us? I felt sick. I don't know the exact amount. Estimate, he demanded. I closed my eyes and tried to calculate. The grocery cards, the emergency cash, the restaurant meals, the car repairs, Daniel's casual loans, the Christmas and birthday money. Maybe $4,000 or $5,000 over 3 years. $5,000, Tyler repeated. Aunt Rebecca, you stole $5,000 from your family? I didn't steal it, I protested weakly. You all offered. I tried to refuse sometimes. Not hard enough, Carmen said, her voice cold. Rebecca, we invited everyone except you to my sister's wedding last year because we thought you couldn't afford the trip to San Diego. We felt horrible about it. We almost paid for your flight ourselves, but we didn't want to embarrass you. Another punch to the gut. Carmen, I had no idea. Of course you didn't, she continued. Because you were so busy playing your little game that you didn't think about how your fake poverty was affecting our decisions. We've been walking on eggshells around you for years, trying not to make you feel bad about your situation. Tyler was scrolling through his phone again. I'm looking up your cases, Aunt Rebecca. It says here you presided over the landmark Henderson adoption case that established new precedent for same-sex couples, and the Brennan domestic violence case that changed state sentencing guidelines, and, holy crap, you sent Senator Morrison's son to jail for drug possession. Senator Morrison? Daniel's voice cracked. Rebecca, you sent a state senator's son to prison? He was dealing cocaine near a middle school, I said defensively. The sentence was appropriate for the crime. You sentenced a senator's son, my father repeated slowly. A sitting family court judge with that kind of authority, and we've been treating you like you needed our help. The full scope of the absurdity was starting to hit them. I could see it in their faces. The realization that they'd been offering career advice to someone who regularly made decisions that affected powerful people's lives, who had been featured in legal journals, who had been appointed by the governor to a position that most attorneys could only dream of achieving. Rebecca, my mother said quietly, when you said you were working late, were you actually in court, making important decisions? Sometimes, I admitted. Family court cases can run long, especially custody disputes or domestic violence hearings. And when we worried about you working with difficult people at the courthouse, Dad said, you were actually dealing with criminals and abusive spouses? I nodded. Among others. Daniel slumped into a chair, finally stopping his restless pacing. Rebecca, do you understand what this means? I don't just look like an idiot. I look like someone who doesn't even know his own sister. My colleagues now think I'm either completely out of touch with my family or that I'm some kind of pathological liar. I'm sorry, I said, and for the first time I truly meant it. I never intended for it to go this far. But it did go this far, Carmen said firmly. And now we need to figure out what else you've been lying about. Carmen's words about figuring out what else I'd been lying about hung in the air like a threat. Tyler was still scrolling through his phone with the determination of a teenager who'd discovered a mystery, while my parents sat in stunned silence, probably mentally reviewing every interaction we'd had over the past 3 years. You know what I don't understand, Tyler said, looking up from his screen, is how you pulled this off logistically. Aunt Rebecca, judges wear robes in court, right? They sit up high behind those big desks. There are probably news photos, court reporters, lawyers who see you every day. How did none of that ever come back to us? It was a surprisingly astute question from my 17-year-old nephew, and one that made me realize just how elaborate my deception had actually become. "Well," I said slowly, "family court isn't like criminal court. There are fewer reporters, and most proceedings are closed to protect the privacy of the families involved." "But there have to be public records," Daniel said, his business analyst mind clearly working. "Court schedules, case filings, judicial assignments." "Rebecca, your name is on public documents as a sitting judge. How has no one we know ever seen that?" I felt the walls closing in as they started to understand the systematic nature of what I'd done. I've been careful about my social footprint. I don't have Facebook or Instagram under my real name. I drive different routes to and from work than I used to when I had the practice. I do my grocery shopping in Riverside instead of here in Willowbrook. "Different routes?" my mother echoed. "Rebecca, you've been living like you're in witness protection." Tyler was typing rapidly on his phone. "I'm searching for news articles about you," he announced. "Because if you've been on CNN and making landmark rulings, there has to be coverage." "Tyler, maybe that's not." Carmen started, but he was already reading. "Here's an article from the State Bar Journal. Judge Rebecca Clearwater's innovative approach to high-conflict custody cases has been praised by family law experts statewide. It's from 8 months ago." He looked up at me with an expression mixing admiration and betrayal. 8 months ago, and none of us knew. My father was shaking his head slowly. "Rebecca, this article describes you as one of the state's most respected voices in family law reform. That's not luck or political appointment. That's genuine professional achievement." "And here's another one," Tyler continued relentlessly. From the Riverside Daily News, Judge Clearwater's courtroom is known for its efficiency and fairness, with one of the lowest appeal rates in the county. It mentions that you've handled over 2,000 cases since taking the bench. 2,000 cases, Daniel repeated, sinking deeper into his chair. "Rebecca, you've made legal decisions affecting thousands of people's lives, and I've been telling you to consider applying for receptionist positions." Carmen had gone very quiet, and I could see her processing something that was making her increasingly uncomfortable. "Rebecca," she said finally, "last month when you came to dinner you asked if you could take some leftovers home, quote, for lunch tomorrow. You specifically mentioned that buying lunch every day was getting expensive. The memory made me cringe. I was just trying to stay consistent with the character." "The character?" My mother's voice rose. "Rebecca, this wasn't a role you were playing. This was your family. We were genuinely worried about you buying lunch." Tyler had found something else. "Aunt Rebecca, it says here that you were featured as one of 40 under 40 rising stars in law by Pacific Legal Magazine 2 years ago. The article mentions your rapid rise from solo practitioner to respected jurist and calls your appointment well-deserved recognition of exceptional legal talent." Each revelation was like another brick in the wall of my elaborate deception. I could see my family's faces changing as they realized not just that I'd lied, but how extensively I'd had to lie to maintain the fiction. "This is what I don't understand," Daniel said, his voice getting sharper. "Rebecca, these articles paint you as someone who's not just successful but genuinely distinguished in your field. Why would you hide that? Why would you prefer to have us think you're struggling?" Before I could answer, Tyler made a small gasping sound. "Oh my God! Aunt Rebecca, there's a photo here from some legal conference. You're sitting at a panel discussion about family law reform. The caption says you were the keynote speaker." He turned his phone toward the room, and I saw my family staring at the image of me in a professional black suit, sitting behind a nameplate that read, "The Honorable Rebecca Clearwater," addressing what looked like a room full of attorneys and judges. "Keynote speaker," my father repeated. "Rebecca, keynote speakers are experts in their field. They're people other professionals come to learn from." Carmen was looking at the photo with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Rebecca, in this picture you look confident, authoritative, nothing like how you act when you're here with us." That observation hit harder than I'd expected. She was right. In my professional life, I commanded respect, made difficult decisions under pressure, and was sought out for my expertise. But with my family, I'd been playing a diminished version of myself for so long that I'd almost forgotten who I really was. There's more, Tyler said, scrolling again. She's been quoted in legal journals, served on state bar committees, and… Wait, this is crazy. Aunt Rebecca, did you know they named a scholarship after you? What? I said, genuinely surprised. The Rebecca Clearwater Scholarship for Women in Family Law at Portland Law School. It says here it was established last year to honor your, quote, commitment to justice and advocacy for vulnerable families. Tyler looked up at me with something approaching awe. They named a scholarship after you, and you've been pretending to worry about grocery money. My mother had tears in her eyes now, but I couldn't tell if they were from pride or hurt. Rebecca, a scholarship in your name. That's an incredible honor. And we missed it. We missed celebrating with you because we didn't even know it happened. The weight of what I'd stolen from them, and from myself, was starting to sink in. It wasn't just about the money they'd given me or the condescending advice. I'd robbed them of the chance to be proud of me, to celebrate my achievements, to understand who I really was. Daniel was staring at his hands. Rebecca, last Christmas when you gave Tyler a $50 gift card to the bookstore, I felt bad that you couldn't afford something nicer. I almost supplemented it myself. I remember that, Tyler said quietly. I felt bad too. I didn't want you to spend money you didn't have. He paused, then his voice got stronger. But you did have it, didn't you? You could have afforded whatever you wanted to get me. Tyler, the gift card wasn't about money. Yes, it was, he interrupted, and for the first time he sounded truly angry. It was about maintaining your lie. You gave me a cheap gift so we'd keep thinking you were poor. You chose your deception over making me feel valued. That accusation cut deep because it was true. I had made countless small decisions over 3 years that prioritized maintaining my fiction over authentic relationships with the people I loved. Carmen had taken Tyler's phone and was scrolling through the articles herself. Rebecca, according to this, you've been invited to speak at conferences across the country. You've testified before state legislative committees about family law reform. You've been consulted on proposed changes to custody statutes. She looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before, like she was looking at a stranger. You're not just a judge, you're a recognized expert in your field. You're influential. You shape policy that affects families throughout the state. The scope of my actual professional life was hitting them like a series of physical blows. Each new revelation made my 3-year charade seem more elaborate and more cruel. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest, Daniel said, his voice deadly serious. Is there anything else? Any other major lies about your life, your work, your finances, your living situation? Because if we're going to move forward as a family, I need to know everything. I looked around the room at these people who loved me, people I'd systematically deceived for 3 years, and realized that the time for partial truths was over. They deserved to know everything, not just about my career, but about who I'd really become and how far I'd gone to maintain my elaborate fiction. There's more, I said quietly, and watched their faces register a mixture of resignation and dread. The words, "there's more," seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the room. Carmen's face went pale, Tyler stopped scrolling through his phone, and Daniel looked like he was bracing for another blow. My parents exchanged a glance that spoke volumes about their growing dread. "What kind of more?" Daniel asked, his voice carefully controlled. I took a deep breath, knowing that once I started down this path there would be no going back. The financial picture is more complicated than just my salary. When I was appointed to the bench, I had to put my assets in a blind trust to avoid conflicts of interest. But before that happened, I made some investments that have done very well. What kind of investments? My father asked, his accountant instincts immediately engaged. Real estate primarily. I bought a small apartment building in downtown Riverside 3 years ago, just before the revitalization project was announced. It's now worth almost double what I paid for it. Carmen made a small choking sound. You own an apartment building? A 4-unit building, I clarified, as if that made it less significant. The rental income covers the mortgage and provides additional monthly income. Tyler had started typing on his phone again. How much additional income? About $3,200 a month after expenses. The silence that followed was deafening. I could practically see Daniel doing the math. My judicial salary plus rental income meant I was making well over $200,000 annually. Rebecca, my mother said slowly, you make more money in a month than most people make in 3 months, and you've been accepting $50 grocery gift cards from me? Before I could respond, Tyler held up his phone triumphantly. I found the property records. Aunt Rebecca, you paid $380,000 for that building, and according to the tax assessor, it's now valued at $720,000. She's a real estate investor, Daniel said flatly. My sister, who I thought couldn't afford decent clothes, owns investment property worth $750,000. But Tyler wasn't done investigating. Wait, there's more property listed under your name. Another townhouse in southeast Portland, and, is this right? A cabin near Mount Hood? I felt my stomach drop. Tyler, maybe you should stop. A cabin? Carmen interrupted. Rebecca, how many properties do you own? 4, I admitted quietly. 4 properties, my father repeated. Rebecca, that's not having a job. That's having a real estate portfolio. Tyler was reading from his phone with the relentless enthusiasm of someone who discovered a treasure map. The Portland townhouse is listed as a short-term rental. And the cabin, it says here it's a luxury vacation rental that books for $300 a night. You're running rental businesses, Daniel said, his voice getting higher. You're not just a judge. You're a judge with multiple income streams. You're probably making more money than anyone in this room. My mother had gone very quiet, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Rebecca, last month when your car broke down, you called Daniel to pick you up from the mechanic because you said you couldn't afford a taxi. You have 4 properties and multiple income streams, and you called your brother for a $15 cab ride. The shame was overwhelming. I know how it sounds. It sounds like you've been playing games with people who love you, Carmen said, her voice sharp with anger. Rebecca, do you understand what you've put us through? The worry, the guilt about our own success when we thought you were struggling? Tyler had found something else. Aunt Rebecca, this is insane. I'm looking at your cabin's listing on vacation rental websites. It's gorgeous. Hot tub, mountain views, professionally decorated. The reviews call it luxury accommodations. People pay $300 a night to stay there, and you've been letting us think you live paycheck to paycheck. Daniel was pacing again, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, anger, and what looked like genuine hurt. Rebecca, I need to understand the timeline here. When did you buy these properties? Because if you owned investment real estate while you were accepting money from us. I bought the apartment building right after my appointment was confirmed, I said, the Portland townhouse about 18 months ago, and the cabin last year. So for the past 2 years, my father said slowly, you've been building a real estate empire while we've been giving you financial assistance because we thought you needed help. Carmen pulled out her own phone. I'm looking up your cabin. Mountain Vista Retreat, 5-star reviews. Luxury amenities. Rebecca, this place rents for more per night than some people make in a week. She showed the phone to Daniel, whose face went from pale to red. This is your cabin? Rebecca, this place is nicer than our house. Look at this. Granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, a deck overlooking the mountain. This is a luxury property. Tyler was still scrolling. According to the booking calendar, it's reserved almost every weekend through the summer. At $300 a night, that's serious money. How much money? Daniel demanded. I knew I had to tell them everything now. The cabin generates about $4,000 a month during peak season, less in winter. Overall, maybe $35,000 annually. $35,000 a year, my mother repeated. From one property. Rebecca, that's more than many people's entire salaries. Daniel stopped pacing and turned to face me directly. Let me make sure I understand this correctly. You're a sitting judge making $165,000 a year. You own 4 properties worth well over $1 million combined. You have rental income from multiple sources totaling, $70,000 or $80,000 annually? You're making $250,000 a year, and you've been accepting charity from your family? When he laid it out like that, the enormity of my deception hit me like a physical blow. It's not quite that much? How much? Tyler interrupted. Exactly how much money do you make? I closed my eyes and did the calculation I'd been avoiding. Last year, with all income sources, about $235,000. The number hung in the air like an accusation. Carmen made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob. My mother looked like she might faint. Tyler's mouth fell open. $250,000, Daniel said quietly. Rebecca, you make more money than a lot of corporate executives. You make more than some small company's entire annual revenue. And you let Mom worry about your heating bills, Tyler added, his voice thick with betrayal. My mother was crying now, not the gentle tears of earlier, but the harsh sobs of someone who's been deeply wounded. Rebecca, I lost sleep worrying about you. I worried that you weren't eating enough, that you couldn't afford your medications, that you might get evicted from your apartment. What apartment? Carmen asked suddenly. You said you live in a townhouse worth $500,000. The lies were unraveling faster than I could manage them. I do. I haven't lived in an apartment for 2 years. But you told us about apartment problems, my father said, his voice getting dangerous. Noise complaints, issues with the landlord, problems with the heating system. I made those up, I admitted. I needed excuses for why I couldn't host family gatherings or have you visit. You made up problems, Tyler repeated. You created fake stress in your life so we'd feel sorry for you while you were actually living in luxury. Daniel was staring at me like he'd never seen me before. Rebecca, this isn't just deception. This is psychological manipulation. You've been systematically lying to create sympathy while living better than any of us. Carmen was looking at something on her phone, her face growing increasingly horrified. Rebecca, I'm looking at real estate photos of your actual townhouse. River views, granite countertops, 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, attached garage. This isn't just nice, this is beautiful. She turns the phone toward the room, and I watched my family stare at photos of my actual home, the home they'd never been invited to see, the home I'd hidden from them for 2 years, while accepting their pity and their money. You've been living like this, my mother said through her tears, while letting us think you needed our help. The full scope of my deception was finally laid bare, and I realized that what I'd done went far beyond lying about my job. I'd created an entirely fictional version of my life, stolen money from people who loved me, and manipulated their emotions for 3 years. The sister they thought they knew, struggling, grateful, humble, had never existed at all. The silence that followed my admission stretched on until it became unbearable. My mother's crying had subsided into quiet hiccups, but the damage was written across every face in the room. Daniel looked like he was calculating exactly how much of a fool I'd made him, while Carmen stared at the photos of my townhouse with the expression of someone trying to solve an impossible puzzle. It was Tyler who finally broke the silence, his teenage voice cracking with emotion. Aunt Rebecca, I defended you. When kids at school made jokes about having a janitor in the family, I defended you. I told them that honest work was nothing to be ashamed of, that you were helping people even if it wasn't glamorous. The pain in his voice was like a knife through my chest. Tyler, I never wanted. Yes, you did, he interrupted, standing up abruptly. You wanted exactly this. You wanted us to feel sorry for you, to make sacrifices for you, to worry about you. and while we were doing that, you were laughing at us." "I wasn't laughing at anyone," I protested, but even as I said it, I knew how hollow it sounded. Daniel finally stopped his pacing and sat down heavily across from me. "Rebecca, I need you to help me understand something. Last Christmas, when Tyler wanted that expensive laptop for college prep, we almost didn't get it for him. Because we were saving money to help you with what we thought were your financial struggles. We bought him a cheaper model and put the difference aside in case you had an emergency." The memory hit me like ice water. I remembered Tyler's slight disappointment when he opened his gift, how he'd tried to hide it, how grateful he'd been even though it wasn't quite what he'd hoped for. "You chose to get Tyler a lesser gift," Carmen said, her voice deadly quiet, "so you could help someone who is making $250,000 a year." Tyler's face flushed red. "I told my friends I was grateful for the laptop you could afford, Dad. I made excuses about why it didn't have all the features I needed because I didn't want you to feel bad about money being tight because of Aunt Rebecca." "Jesus Christ, Rebecca," Daniel exploded, finally losing his controlled composure. My son felt guilty about wanting a better computer because he thought his aunt needed grocery money. A 17-year-old kid was making sacrifices because you were running a con on your own family. My father, who had been uncharacteristically quiet during the worst revelations, finally spoke. "Rebecca, I want you to think carefully about your answer to this question. When your mother gave you those $50 grocery cards every month, did you spend them on groceries?" The question caught me off guard. Sometimes, he repeated. "What did you do with them the other times?" I felt my cheeks burn. "I gave them to my housekeeper." "Your housekeeper?" my mother whispered. "You have a housekeeper." "Maria comes twice a week," I admitted. "She has 3 kids, and her husband is disabled. I thought the gift cards would help her family more than they'd help me." Carmen made a strangled sound. "So you were taking grocery money from us and giving it to your employee? Rebecca, that's not charity. That's money laundering." "It wasn't money laundering," I said defensively. "I was helping someone who actually needed it." "With our money!" Daniel shouted. "Rebecca, if you wanted to help your housekeeper, you could have given her your own money. You didn't need to steal from us to play philanthropist." Tyler was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Complete disillusionment. "Aunt Rebecca, do you understand what you've done? You've made us all complicit in your lies. Every time we helped you, every time we made sacrifices, every time we worried about you, we were participating in something that wasn't real." The truth of what he'd said hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't just lied to my family. I'd made them unwilling actors in my elaborate fiction. Carmen was scrolling through her phone again, but this time her expression was different. She looked determined, almost businesslike. "Rebecca, I'm adding up everything we've given you over the past 3 years. The grocery cards, the cash, the times we've paid for meals, the car repairs, the Christmas money, the emergency funds." "Carmen, you don't need to." "Actually, I do," she said firmly. "Because this isn't just about hurt feelings anymore. This is about money you took under false pretenses." She looked up from her calculations. $6,847. That's what our family has given you in direct financial assistance over 3 years. "Almost $7,000, my father said slowly. "Rebecca, $7,000 to someone who needed it would have been an act of love. $7,000 to someone making $250,000 annually is theft." Daniel was nodding grimly. "And that doesn't include the indirect costs, the cheaper gifts we bought Tyler to save money for your quote-quote emergencies, the vacations we didn't take because we were worried about your financial stability, the restaurant dinners where we insisted on paying because we thought you couldn't afford it." My mother had stopped crying, but her face was harder than I'd ever seen it. "Rebecca, last month when I suggested you apply for food assistance, you told me you'd look into it. Were you actually considering taking government benefits you didn't need?" The memory made me sick. "No, Mom, I would never have actually applied." "But you let me research the application process for you," she continued relentlessly. I spent an entire afternoon on the phone with social services, trying to understand what programs might be available for someone in your supposed situation. Carmen looked up from her phone with a new expression of horror. Rebecca, my sister works for the Department of Human Services. She pulled strings to get you expedited consideration for heating assistance last winter. She called in personal favors for someone who owns 4 properties. The web of people I'd inadvertently involved in my deception was growing larger and more complicated by the minute. Carmen's sister, social services workers, Maria, my housekeeper, who'd unknowingly received stolen grocery money, all of them had been touched by my lies. There's something else, Tyler said quietly. He'd been unusually subdued for the past few minutes, which should have been my first warning. I've been thinking about the scholarship. What scholarship? Daniel asked. The one named after Aunt Rebecca. The Rebecca Clearwater Scholarship for Women in Family Law. Tyler looked directly at me. Aunt Rebecca, did you fund that scholarship yourself? The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, waiting for an answer I didn't want to give. Tyler, that's not really relevant. Did you fund your own scholarship? He pressed. I closed my eyes. The initial endowment was $50,000. I contributed to it. How much did you contribute? My father asked, his accountant's instincts fully engaged. All of it, I whispered. You donated $50,000 to create a scholarship in your own name, Carmen said slowly, while taking grocery money from your family. Daniel's voice was barely controlled. Rebecca, you gave $50,000 to a law school and then came to us asking for gas money. The moral arithmetic was devastating. While my family had been scrimp and save to help their struggling sister, I'd been making major charitable donations and building a real estate empire. This is sociopathic behavior, Carmen said bluntly. Rebecca, normal people don't create elaborate fictional versions of their lives to manipulate their families. Normal people don't take charity while living in luxury. Tyler stood up again, his teenage gangly frame somehow managing to look dignified. I can't be in the same room with you right now, he said quietly. Aunt Rebecca, I love you, but I don't know who you are. The person I thought was my aunt apparently never existed. As he walked toward the door, he turned back one more time. And the worst part? If you'd just told us the truth, we would have been proud of you. We would have celebrated your success. Instead, you turned our love into a joke. The sound of the front door closing behind him seemed to echo through the house like a gunshot. In the silence that followed, I realized that the consequences of my 3-year deception were only just beginning. Tyler's departure left a vacuum in the room that seemed to pull all the air out with him. The front door's decisive click reverberated through the house like a gavel falling, and I realized that my nephew, the one person whose opinion had always mattered most to me, had just delivered the harshest verdict of all. Daniel broke the silence first, his voice eerily calm in a way that was somehow more frightening than his earlier anger. Rebecca, we need to talk about what happens next. Because this can't just end with apologies and promises to do better. My mother was staring at her hands, her shoulders shaking with what I realized weren't sobs anymore, but the tremors of someone trying to control deep rage. When she looked up at me, her eyes were harder than I'd ever seen them. Rebecca Marie Clearwater, she said, using my full name the way she had when I was in serious trouble as a child. You are going to write us a check for every penny we've given you under false pretenses, today, before you leave this house. Mom, I understand you're upset, but… Upset? She interrupted, her voice rising for the first time all afternoon. Rebecca, upset is when someone forgets your birthday or arrives late to dinner. This is betrayal. This is financial fraud committed against your own family. Carmen was nodding vigorously. Your mother's right. Rebecca, you took money from us knowing we couldn't afford to give it. We've been living more modestly for 3 years because we thought you needed help. My father, who had been writing something on a napkin, looked up grimly. Rebecca, I've been doing some calculations. The direct financial impact is nearly $7,000. But that's just the beginning. Carmen, what did you spend on that research into assistance programs? Probably 20 hours of time, Carmen replied. Plus phone calls, gas money driving to social services offices, photocopying documents. Maybe $200 in direct costs, but the time. And my sister burned favors with her colleagues, Carmen continued. Professional relationships she's built over 15 years in social work, and she spent them trying to help someone who owns more property than she does. Daniel was taking notes now, his business training kicking in. We need to document everything. Not just the money, but the opportunity costs, the emotional damage, the professional embarrassment. Rebecca, do you understand that Carmen's sister could face disciplinary action if her supervisors discover she expedited services for someone who wasn't eligible? The scope of collateral damage was growing beyond what I'd ever imagined. I never thought. That's the problem, my father interrupted. You never thought about anyone but yourself. Rebecca, you've potentially compromised a social worker's career so you could maintain your charade. Carmen was scrolling through her phone again. I'm texting my sister right now to give her a heads up. She needs to know the real situation before someone else figures it out. As she typed, the reality of what I'd done began to crystallize. This wasn't just about my family anymore. There were professional and legal implications I hadn't considered. There's something else we need to discuss, Daniel said, his voice taking on the tone he used in difficult business negotiations. Rebecca, what you've done isn't just morally wrong, it's potentially criminal. Criminal? I felt the blood drain from my face. You obtained money through false pretenses, my father explained. In legal terms, that's fraud. The amounts might be small enough to avoid prosecution, but the pattern of behavior over 3 years. Daniel nodded grimly. And as a sitting judge, you're held to higher ethical standards. Rebecca, if the Judicial Ethics Committee learns about this, you could face formal disciplinary action. The thought of facing my colleagues, of having my professional reputation destroyed by my personal decisions, made me physically nauseous. Daniel, surely you wouldn't. I'm not going to report you, he said quickly, but that doesn't mean someone else won't. Mr. Thornfield heard enough today to understand that something inappropriate happened. He knows you're a judge, and he knows I've been treating you like charity case. If he starts asking questions. Carmen had finished texting and was looking at me with the expression of someone trying to solve a complex problem. Rebecca, we need to know that this stops today. Completely. No more lies, no more deception, no more taking advantage of people who care about you. And we need restitution, my mother added firmly. Full restitution. Not just the money, though that needs to be repaid immediately, but acknowledgement of what you've done and steps to make sure it never happens again. I nodded, knowing I had no choice. What do you want me to do? Daniel had clearly been thinking about this while the rest of us talked. First, you write us a check for $6,847 today. Non-negotiable. That covers the direct financial assistance. Second, my father continued, you contact Carmen's sister and apologize personally for the position you put her in. You explain the situation and take full responsibility. Third, Carmen added, you come clean to Tyler. Not just an apology, a full explanation of why you did this and what you're doing to make it right. He deserves that much. My mother's contribution was the most painful. Fourth, you host a family dinner at your real home. Your actual townhouse with the river views and granite countertops. We're gonna see who you really are and how you really live. The thought of my family and my beautiful home, seeing the life I'd hidden from them, was terrifying. But I knew they were right. The time for hiding was over. And fifth, Daniel said, his voice deadly serious, you get professional help. Rebecca, what you've done isn't normal behavior. Healthy people don't maintain elaborate deceptions for years. You need to talk to someone about why you did this. You think I need therapy? I think you need to understand why you chose manipulation over honesty, Carmen said bluntly. Because until you figure that out, none of us can trust that this won't happen again. My mother was writing something on the back of an envelope. Rebecca, I want you to understand something. The money isn't really the issue. We can afford what we gave you, even if it was misguided. The issue is that you made us complicit in your lies. She looked up at me with tears in her eyes again. Every time we helped you, we felt good about ourselves. We felt like we were being generous, loving family members. You turned our compassion into foolishness. The emotional damage was so much deeper than the financial cost. I'd corrupted their memories of their own generosity, made them question their judgment, turned their love into a weapon against themselves. There's one more thing, Daniel said quietly. Rebecca, you need to understand that forgiveness isn't automatic just because you're family. Tyler walked out of here, and I don't know when, or if, he'll be ready to see you again. And even if we forgive you, Carmen added, things can't go back to the way they were. We can't unknow what we now know about your capacity for deception. My father nodded agreement. Rebecca, you've shown us that you're capable of maintaining an elaborate lie for years while watching people you claim to love make sacrifices based on false information. That's not something we can just forget. As I sat there surrounded by the wreckage of my family relationships, I realized that writing a check for $7,000 was going to be the easy part. The real question was whether the trust I'd destroyed could ever be rebuilt, and whether the sister, daughter, and aunt they'd thought they knew could somehow be recovered from the ruins of my 3-year deception. I'll write the check now, I said quietly, reaching for my purse. It's a start, Daniel replied, but his tone made it clear that it was only the beginning of a very long process of trying to make things right. 6 months later, I stood in my actual kitchen, the one with granite countertops and river views that my family had seen in real estate photos but never in person, preparing dinner for the people I'd spent 3 years systematically deceiving. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was finally hosting them in the home I'd hidden from them, using ingredients I could actually afford instead of the humble meals I'd claimed were all my budget allowed. The therapy sessions Dr. Martinez had recommended after that devastating confrontation at Tyler's graduation party had been as painful as they were necessary. Twice a week for 6 months, I'd sat in her comfortable office trying to unpack why I'd chosen elaborate deception over honest communication with the people who loved me most. You created a narrative where you were simultaneously the victim and the secret victor, she'd explained during one particularly difficult session. You got to feel superior to your family while also receiving their sympathy and financial support. It gave you control over how they perceived you while allowing you to feel martyred by their perceived condescension. The psychological analysis had been brutal but accurate. I'd been so resentful of Daniel's lifelong pattern of treating me as the lesser sibling that I'd created a scenario where I could feel superior while still punishing him for his attitude. The restitution check I'd written that day had been easy compared to the personal apologies that followed. Carmen's sister Maria, not my housekeeper Maria but the social worker Maria, had been professional but cold when I called to explain the situation. Judge Clearwater, she'd said, her voice carefully neutral, I appreciate you coming forward, but you need to understand that I'm going to have to report this to my supervisor. I used departmental resources and expedited processes for someone who wasn't eligible for assistance. The conversation had been excruciating, but necessary. Maria had ultimately kept her job, though she'd received a formal reprimand that would remain in her file for 2 years. The knowledge that my deception had damaged an innocent person's career was a weight I carried daily. My relationship with Tyler had required the most delicate handling. The week after the party, I'd driven to his house and asked if he'd be willing to take a walk with me, somewhere neutral where he could leave if the conversation became too difficult. I don't understand why you did it, Aunt Rebecca, he'd said as we walked along the Willowbrook River Trail. I mean, I get being upset with Dad for being condescending, but why involve the rest of us? Why make Grandma worry about you when you didn't need her to? That question had haunted me through months of therapy. I think I was so focused on proving a point to your father that I lost sight of how my deception was affecting everyone else, I'd told him. I was selfish and cruel, and I'm sorry. Tyler had been quiet for a long time before responding. "The thing is, if you'd just told us the truth from the beginning, we would have been proud of you. Dad might have been a jerk about it at first, but eventually he would have come around. Instead, you made us all look stupid." That conversation had taken place 4 months ago, and Tyler had slowly begun accepting my invitations to lunch or coffee. Our relationship was different now. More cautious, less warm, but it was rebuilding. He'd even agreed to come to tonight's dinner, though he'd made it clear he was coming for his grandparents' sake, not mine. The doorbell rang, interrupting my nervous preparation. Through the peephole, I could see my parents standing on the front porch, my mother holding a covered dish despite my insistence that I would handle all the cooking. "Rebecca, dear," she said as I opened the door, "I brought my green bean casserole. I know you said not to bring anything, but it didn't feel right coming empty-handed." Some things, thankfully, hadn't changed. My mother would bring food to family dinners if she had to smuggle it in her purse. My father was looking around the foyer with the expression of someone trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he'd believed for 3 years. "This is beautiful, Rebecca. The listing photos didn't do it justice." "Thank you," I said, taking their coats. "I'll give you the full tour after everyone arrives." Daniel and Carmen came next, followed by Tyler, who looked around with the wide eyes of someone seeing something for the first time despite having researched it extensively online. "Aunt Rebecca," he said quietly, "this place is really nice." "Thank you," I replied, unsure how to interpret his tone. As we gathered in the living room before dinner, the atmosphere was still somewhat strained, but it was different from the raw anger and hurt of 6 months ago. There was a cautious civility now, a willingness to try rebuilding what had been broken. "Rebecca," my father said, "we should probably talk about the elephant in the room. How are things going with Dr. Martinez?" The therapy sessions weren't a secret. Part of my commitment to rebuilding trust had been complete transparency about my efforts to understand and change my behavior. "It's been helpful," I said honestly. "Difficult, but helpful. She's helping me understand why I felt the need to control how you all perceived me, instead of just trusting that you'd love me regardless of my success or failure." Carmen leaned forward slightly. "And what have you learned?" I'd known this question would come up, and I'd spent considerable time preparing for it. I learned that I was more concerned with winning an argument with Daniel than I was with having honest relationships with any of you. I turned my resentment about childhood family dynamics into a weapon that hurt everyone. Daniel, who had been quietly observing since arriving, finally spoke. "Rebecca, I've been doing some thinking too, about the way I treated you, the things I said. Dr. Martinez was right when she told you that this didn't happen in a vacuum." This was new. Daniel had never mentioned seeing Dr. Martinez. "I called her after the graduation party," he continued. "I asked if she thought I needed to examine my own behavior. She said she couldn't discuss your case, but she could recommend someone for me to talk to." Carmen nodded. "We've both been seeing Dr. Patterson, trying to understand how we contributed to the family dynamics that made you feel like deception was your only option." "You didn't contribute to anything," I said quickly. "What I did was my choice." "That's true," my mother said, "but it's also true that families develop patterns over years, and some of our patterns weren't healthy." Tyler, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly spoke up. "I think what Grandma means is that Dad has always been kind of a jerk about other people's success. Not just yours, Aunt Rebecca." "Tyler," Daniel started, but Tyler continued. "No, Dad, it's true. Remember when Mom's cousin got promoted to regional manager at her company? You spent the whole dinner explaining why regional management wasn't really that impressive, and when Coach Martinez's son got into Stanford, you made comments about how expensive it was and whether it was really worth it." The accuracy of Tyler's observation was uncomfortable, but undeniable. Daniel had always had a tendency to diminish other people's achievements, probably as a way of making his own seem more significant. "You're right," Daniel admitted. "I've been working on that with Dr. Patterson. Apparently I have some issues with competitive behavior that go back to childhood." Carmen smiled slightly. Dr. Patterson calls it chronic one-upping syndrome. Daniel feels compelled to be the most successful person in any room. Which doesn't excuse what I did, I said firmly, but it does help explain why I felt like honesty wasn't an option. My mother was nodding thoughtfully. Rebecca, I think we all played a role in creating an environment where you felt like your worth was tied to competing with Daniel instead of just being yourself. As we moved to the dining room for dinner, I realized that something unexpected had happened over the past 6 months. My deception had forced our entire family to examine patterns of behavior that had been toxic for years. The crisis I'd created had become a catalyst for conversations we'd never been willing to have before. "This is strange," Tyler said as we sat down at my dining room table, "but in a weird way, I think our family is more honest now than it was before, even though trust is still rebuilding." He was right. The conversations we were having now about competition, resentment, family dynamics, and the need for authentic relationships were deeper and more genuine than anything we'd shared during the 3 years of my deception. Rebuilding trust was going to take time, and some relationships might never fully recover. But for the first time in months, I felt like we were building something real, instead of maintaining something artificial. 1 year after Tyler's graduation party, the day that changed everything, I found myself sitting in the same courthouse where my deception had begun, but this time I was there as myself. Completely, authentically myself. No pretense, no hidden truths, no carefully constructed narratives designed to manipulate anyone's perception of my life. It was a Wednesday morning, and I was presiding over a particularly complex custody case involving a family not unlike my own, siblings who had spent years harboring resentments and misunderstandings that had finally exploded into a legal battle that was tearing their children apart. As I listened to their attorneys present arguments built on years of accumulated grievances and half-truths, I couldn't help but see parallels to my own family's journey. "Your Honor," one of the attorneys was saying, "my client has been systematically excluded from family decisions despite her equal stake in their mother's estate. Her brother has created a narrative where she's portrayed as irresponsible and financially unstable, when in fact she owns a successful business and has been contributing to their mother's care for years." The words hit me like an echo from my own story. Here was another family where assumptions and carefully constructed narratives had replaced honest communication, where pride and resentment had metastasized into something that required judicial intervention to resolve. After the hearing concluded, I sat in my chambers thinking about how much had changed since that devastating afternoon when Mr. Thornfield had shattered my carefully constructed world with 2 simple words: "Your Honor." The immediate aftermath had been brutal. Within a week of Tyler's graduation party, news of the incident had somehow reached the local legal community. Nothing official, just whispered conversations about Judge Clearwater's interesting family dynamics and speculation about what had really happened at a social gathering involving Pinnacle Industries' CEO. My colleague Judge Harrison had been the one to address it directly. "Rebecca," she'd said during a private conversation in her chambers, "I don't know what happened at your nephew's party, and frankly, it's none of my business. But I want you to know that whatever personal issues you're dealing with, they don't affect my professional opinion of your work." That conversation had meant more to me than she could have known. In a profession where reputation was everything, having the support of my colleagues had been crucial during those difficult months. The judicial ethics investigation I'd feared never materialized. Mr. Thornfield, to his credit, had apparently decided that what he'd witnessed was a family matter rather than a professional concern. When Daniel had finally worked up the courage to approach him at work several weeks later, Thornfield had been gracious. "Daniel," he'd said, according to my brother's recounting, "families are complicated. What matters to me is that you're an excellent sales director, and your sister is clearly an accomplished judge. Whatever personal dynamics you're working through, that's between you and her." The professional crisis I'd feared had never come to pass, but the personal reckoning had been far more challenging than any ethics investigation could have been. Dr. Martinez had helped me understand that my elaborate deception hadn't really been about hiding my success. It had been about controlling how others perceived me while avoiding the vulnerability that comes with authentic relationships. You created a scenario where you could feel superior to your family while simultaneously punishing them for not recognizing your worth, she'd explained. But the price was giving up any chance of genuine connection. The therapy had been transformative, but the real healing had happened around family dinner tables and during long conversations with Tyler, who had ultimately become my most insightful critic and my most generous teacher. Aunt Rebecca, he'd said during one of our coffee dates about 6 months after the revelation, I think the thing that hurt most wasn't the lying about money. It was that you didn't trust us enough to be proud of you. That observation had crystallized something I'd been struggling to understand. I'd been so convinced that my family wouldn't appreciate my success that I'd denied them the opportunity to prove me wrong. Now, as I sat in my chambers reflecting on the past year, I could see how much we'd all grown. Daniel had made genuine progress in addressing his competitive tendencies. Our family gatherings were different now, less focused on status and achievement, more centered on actual connection and honest communication. Carmen had become an unexpected ally in the healing process. Rebecca, she'd told me during one of our monthly coffee meetings that had become a new tradition. What you did was wrong, but it also forced all of us to look at ourselves honestly. That's been a gift, even though it came wrapped in pain. My parents had perhaps changed the most. They'd begun to recognize how their decades-long pattern of comparing Daniel and me had contributed to an environment where authentic communication felt impossible. Family dinners now included conversations about everyone's work and achievements, not just Daniel's latest corporate successes. Tyler, wise beyond his 18 years, had become the family's unofficial mediator. When tensions arose, or old patterns started to resurface, he had a way of cutting through the complexity with simple, direct observations that forced everyone to refocus on what really mattered. But the most significant change had been in me. The person who had spent 3 years maintaining an elaborate deception had learned to live with radical honesty. Not just about financial matters or professional achievements, but about emotions, frustrations, fears, and needs. When I felt overlooked or undervalued, I said so directly instead of plotting elaborate schemes to prove my worth. When I was proud of a professional accomplishment, I shared it openly instead of hiding it behind false modesty. When family dynamics triggered old resentments, I addressed them in the moment rather than letting them fester into something toxic. The trust we'd rebuilt wasn't the same as the trust that had existed before. It was stronger in some ways, built on genuine knowledge of each other rather than assumptions and narratives. But it was also more fragile, requiring constant attention and care. As I prepared to leave my chambers that afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from Tyler. "Family dinner Sunday? I'm bringing my girlfriend to meet everyone. Fair warning, she knows the whole story, and she thinks you're pretty cool." I smiled, remembering the woman I'd been a year ago, so concerned with controlling everyone's perception of my life that I'd missed out on simply living it. Tyler's girlfriend would meet the real me, not some carefully constructed version designed to elicit specific reactions. That evening, I drove home to my beautiful townhouse, the one my family now knew about and had visited many times, and reflected on the year's most important lesson. The truth, even when it's complicated and painful, is always simpler than maintaining a lie. Authentic relationships, even when they're messy and imperfect, are infinitely more valuable than relationships built on deception and control. I'd learned that being truly seen and known by the people you love is worth the risk of being judged or misunderstood. I'd discovered that my family's love was stronger than I'd given it credit for, and that their capacity for growth and forgiveness exceeded my wildest expectations. Most importantly, I'd realized that the person I'd been pretending to be, humble, struggling, grateful for any help, had actually prevented me from becoming the person I was meant to be, confident, successful, generous, and authentically connected to the people who mattered most. The graduation party that had felt like the end of my world had actually been the beginning of my real life. And for that unexpected gift, born from the ashes of my own deception, I would be grateful for the rest of my days. As I tell you this story now, I'm curious about your own experiences. Have you ever found yourself maintaining a version of yourself that wasn't quite true? Have you watched family dynamics shape how you present yourself to the world? How do you handle situations where pride and resentment threaten to override honesty and connection? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear how this story resonates with your own family experiences. And if you found value in my journey from deception to authenticity, please share this story with others who might benefit from understanding that it's never too late to choose truth over comfort, even when that choice comes with a price. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.